Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Allison's Corner. Of course, I am your host, Allison, and I am so blessed and glad that you are able to join us. Now, before we get started, if you are watching this on YouTube, which you should be, or one of the ways that you can listen to us, our background looks a little different. Okay. I am not in my room. Usually you see my room in the background, but I have some news to share with y'all, and that is that I moved. I moved and I am in a completely different space. I actually moved states. So was living in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm originally from Atlanta. That's where I grew up. And I moved to the DMV area. So it has been quite some time that I've moved from Atlanta to the DMV. And I am currently staying with family, but let me tell y'all something. I moved in January and it has been freezing. I am somebody who grew up in the South for majority of their life. I lived in Florida prior to living in Georgia. I lived in Florida for about 12 years. We moved to Florida when I was 1. Okay? I was born in New York. Literally when I turned 1, we moved to Florida, to Miami to be exact. So I really have no recollection of New York and the weather and how cold it can get. I don't know, and unless I've gone up there to visit family, that's my only time. Because I still have family up there. But overall, I'm a Southern girl through and through. So Florida and Georgia. Georgia is more of where my formative years took place because I did middle school, high school. I went to college in state, and of course, after graduating, I moved back home with my parents who are in the Atlanta area, and I've been there up until about a month ago. So I don't know how everybody else is feeling, but by the time you watch this episode or you listen to this episode, you would have heard about the snowstorm that hit even parts of the South. And it's not my first time experiencing snow, but it's my first time really experiencing winter up north because when it snows in Georgia, literally maybe half an inch, the whole city shuts down. The whole city shuts down and it's much different. Whereas here in the DMV up north, it's completely different. Like the show must go on. Everything is business as usual. And it was weird because it was also my first time driving in snow. I've never driven in snow before. So I had to learn very quickly what to do and just navigating everything on top of being new to the area. So with all of that, that's my life update that I have been dealing with within, yeah, about the last month or so. I've been up here. Other than it being cold, I do love it. I can't lie. I really do enjoy the environment. It's new, it's exciting. And it's been a really transformative time in my life. And while it's been very, very transformative, I really wanted to share what I've been going through and also how I've been coping. So, if you're new here, welcome. Grab some water, get comfortable, settle in. And if you've been listening for a while, thank y'all for growing with me, especially because this episode feels very reflective and very intentional. And with this episode, we're going to talk about representation. So, come on. So, because of my move, I wanted to channel people who make me feel seen and heard in a way in this new time of my life. You know, again, I'm in a season where things are completely different. Everything around me is not the same. And so, with thinking about representation, I wanted to more so think about it in the way that representation has on me in a subtle, everyday way. You know, the way that I represent womanhood or other people who I look up to who represent womanhood, the way they represent softness, the way they represent ambition, the way they represent faith, boundaries, timing, self trust. Because whether we realize it or not, we are always representing something. Every time we open our mouths, every time we say yes, every time we say no, every time we choose to move quickly, or even if we choose not to do so, that is in addition to who we are. And I started asking myself a question, and I think a lot of us should ask this question more often. And it's, what kind of woman am I reflecting back into the world? I didn't want to know who I was trying to be or who I am pretending to be online, but who am I actually representing through my choices, through my presence? And when I took the time to sit with that question, I realized that there were certain women who I admire deeply, not because I want their lives, but because they embody the energy that I want to carry. So today's episode is all about those women, the women that I would love to mirror in my everyday life. They are not idols, they are not blueprints, but instead I look to them to be reflections of myself. Because to me, I feel as though these women represent values, they represent posture and presence, and they help me to feel aligned with who I am and who I'm becoming. But I do really want to make this very clear. This isn't about perfection. As you know, every person that I'm going to mention is human. We are complex and we are also evolving. But what I admire in these women is their way of being. And maybe as you listen, it'll inspire you to think about the women, famous or not, whose energy you're consciously or unconsciously carrying around too. So I believe that we are living in a time where everyone is telling women who they are meant to be, right? They're telling us to be louder, be softer, be married by now, have kids by now, be healed by now, be over it by now. And that constant pressure can make you feel like you're doing life wrong when really you're just doing it honestly. So instead of listening to every voice, I've learned instead to just listen to mine. And in listening to my voice, I've begun to ask, what type of womanhood do I respect? What kind of presence feels grounded? And what kind of life feels sustainable? So that's where my list comes from. And that's when I really started to toy with, okay, who are these women? And I feel as if these women are an embodiment of the womanhood that I hope to represent. The first woman I want to spotlight is Viola Davis. Love, love, love Viola. I feel as though Viola represents depth. And when I say depth, I mean emotional honesty without performance. For our book club, which I do have to put something in for that, Allison and Friends book club for the month of January, we read Viola Davis's autobiography, and it was beautiful. And in reading her story, I saw truth without polishing it up for comfort. She is a woman who refuses to shrink her story to make other people feel at ease. And what I admire most about Viola is that she doesn't romanticize struggle, but she also, doesn't hide it either. And she understands that survival shapes authority, and she owns that. And that matters to me because I don't want to create spaces, especially on my podcast, or in my book club or writing in my Substack where people feel like they have to edit their pain to be palatable. And Viola's presence reminds me that your voice matters and it carries weight when you honor the truth fully. Not the inspirational version, not the summarized version, but the real version. And that's the energy that I want to represent. I want to represent depth over digestibility, truth over comfort, and substance over spectacle. When people engage with my work, I want them to feel like they don't have to pretend. Like they can bring their whole story, their whole selves into the room. And that to me is Viola's energy. Next, we have Oprah. And listen, I know Oprah is probably a very obvious answer, but what I admire about her isn't the wealth or the fame, it's the intention behind everything that she's built. To me, Oprah represents legacy thinking. She's never chased moments, but instead she's built movements. And she's built conversations that last decades. And she understands that media isn't just about visibility, but it's also about responsibility. And that resonates with me so much because I don't see Allison's Corner as content for context's sake. I see it as a space for reflection. It's a space for nuance, for people who think deeply about life and want room to process it all out loud. And Oprah's energy reminds me that it's okay to move slowly when you're building something that's meant to last. That you don't have to jump on every trend, that you don't have to monetize everything immediately, that you don't have to be everywhere for you to be impactful. And I want to represent a woman who understands the power of her voice and uses it intentionally. And to me, Oprah shows me that elevation doesn't require urgency, instead, it requires clarity. Then there's Tracy Ellis Ross. So to me, Tracy represents joy without rushing. And I feel like this is so important, especially for women who are in their 30s, who are constantly being reminded of timelines. Tracy lives fully without treating her life like it's on pause until some type of milestone is reached. She doesn't center her worth around what she hasn't done yet. She instead enjoys her life right now. And that's something I admire so deeply because I want to represent a woman who isn't waiting to be happy, who isn't postponing joy, who isn't acting like her life has to start later or after something takes place. You know, Tracy, she represents discipline that doesn't feel harsh. She takes care of herself. She's very consistent. She's grounded, but she's also playful and light and curious. And that is the balance that I want. I don't want to represent hustle culture. I am so over that. I don't want to represent burnout as success because I don't believe in that. But instead, I want to represent sustainable joy. And sustainable joy, or joy in general, it doesn't apologize, it doesn't rush, it exists alongside ambition. And Tracy shows us that that's possible. Next is Sarah Jakes Roberts. So, Sarah represents faith that's operational but not performative. And that distinction matters. I believe her faith isn't loud, but instead I feel as though it's very grounded and it helps in informing her decisions. It shapes her boundaries and it also teaches about patience. And what I admire is that she doesn't move out of pressure. Instead, she chooses to move out of discernment. And that's the energy I want to represent when it comes to my spirituality. Faith as a filter, faith as alignment, faith as stillness before action. I don't have to rush because everyone else is moving. I don't have to force doors to open that aren't opening. And I don't have to explain obedience to people who don't understand it. I want to represent a woman who trusts God quietly and deeply, even when the waiting is uncomfortable. And if I can even go further into Sarah and my admiration for her, I love that she is not ashamed of the things that she's been through. And instead, she uses her life as an example for what God can do and can continue to do if you hold fast into the faith that everything will work out if you trust Him. And then there is Issa Rae. And Issa represents soft power. I feel like with Issa, she shows that you can be ambitious without oversharing, that you can build without narrating every step. That privacy doesn't mean secrecy, it just means boundaries. And that's something I value more and more as I get older. I don't want to represent a woman who feels obligated to explain every pivot or announce every change or to justify every action that I make. I believe that Issa's energy reminds me that you can let your work do the talking, that you can move quietly and still move effectively. And for me, I want to represent confidence that doesn't need constant validation. Next, and this might surprise some of you, but my next woman is Lauren London. And I love Lauren because she represents emotional maturity. She moves slowly, she speaks intentionally, and she also honors her inner world. And I admire that because she doesn't rush healing or try to prove strength through constant activity. Lauren's energy feels calm, it feels safe, it feels very grounded. And that's what I want people to feel when they interact with me or my work. Not chaos, not pressure, not this sense of urgency. Instead, I want people to see me and see my work and think of the word peace. I want to represent a woman who protects her nervous system, who values rest, and who understands that softness is not weakness, but instead it's wisdom. And then there is Rihanna. I love Rihanna because for me, she represents embodied confidence. Listen, she doesn't explain herself to anyone. She doesn't negotiate her standards and she doesn't shrink herself to be liked. And that to me is very powerful. What I admire about Rihanna is that her confidence lives in her body. It lives in her presence. It just lives in her stillness. And she is somebody who doesn't chase approval and she expects respect. And that's the energy I want to represent. Not arrogance, not performative confidence, but instead grounded self trust. And finally, we have Michelle Obama. And Michelle represents becoming. I feel as though she honors evolution and she allows herself to change her mind. And she understands that life happens when the chapters just unfold. And that matters because I don't want to represent a woman who feels trapped by old versions of herself, or who feels ashamed of evolving, or feels pressured to have it all figured out. Michelle's energy reminds me that timing matters and that having patience is powerful, that growth doesn't have to be rushed for it to be real. And in seeing her move in the world, I feel as though that is a beautiful reminder to know who we are, to know who we are becoming, and to honor that as well. So, when I think about the women that I want to mirror, especially again in this new season of my life, what I'm really talking about is the energy that I choose to carry. These women represent depth, faith, joy, privacy, peace, confidence, patience. That's what I want to represent in the world. And my question for you is, what kind of woman or human are you representing, intentionally or not? Who influences your posture? Who influences your pace? Who influences your boundaries? You don't have to answer right now. I just want you to sit with it. And if this episode resonated with you, I love to hear who is on your list. Now, before we go, of course, I'm going to leave y'all with a quote. And this one is from Isaiah 43, verse 19. It says, "Behold, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it?" As always, thank y'all for listening. Thank you guys for reflecting. Thank you for holding space with me. As always, God bless. Have an amazing day. And thank you for listening to Allison's Corner.